So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us in the first of the 3 talks that we will host on the occasion of the exhibition Pretérito Perfecto. This is the first one. The next one will be next Friday with Rogelio López Cuenca, and the last one, it will be with Grada Quilomba. So for those who haven't been able to see it, Pretérito Perfecto is an exhibition curated by Bruno Leitao with works by Ángela Ferreira, Grada Quilomba, and Rogelio López Cuenca. It's a very, very strong proposal, critical, beautiful, with very, very powerful works. We are very happy to host it. Thank you, Bruno. It's been a real pleasure. And it's really a luxury for us to have the work and the amazing installation by Ángela Ferreira. So we hope that you will enjoy this talk, and you will get to learn a little bit more about the show. So I introduce you to Bruno Leitao, the curator of the show, and Ángela Ferreira from her studio in Portugal, in Lisboa. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but we are hoping to welcome her very soon in Madrid, or go to visit her as soon as possible. Thank you, Ángela, for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, good morning, Nerea. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you again for the invitation to do this wonderful show with 3 wonderful artists. It's been a pleasure, and I thank Idoia and Pedro, who are in the background as well.
By the way, Pedro, if you want to ask any questions, you can text in the chat and Pedro will note them, and then you can probably ask them yourselves, or we will open some questioning at the end.
Okay.
Sorry.
So the way that this is going to happen is that I'm going to have a chat with Ángela. I'm going to introduce her before, of course. We're going to have a chat about some of the issues of the piece in the exhibition and other pieces in our practice. And then we open the floor, so to speak, to questions. We are in Ángela's home. It's not the studio, but it's also a very important part in your production as well. And we'll find out why during the conversation. So I just want to take the time to introduce very briefly who's Ángela Ferreira and what she's been doing. So Ángela Ferreira was born in Maputo in Mozambique and graduated in sculpture from the University of Cape Town in apartheid-ridden South Africa. In keeping with the biography, her work was from early on driven by a clear political intention, and it structures itself as a series of researches on the origins of identity and on the problems of intercultural dialectics, which she often explores by addressing certain works in discourses from modernism. Ferreira's work is concerned with the ongoing impact of colonialism and post-colonialism on contemporary society, an investigation that is conducted through in-depth research and distillation of ideas into concise and resonant forms. She represented Portugal at the 52nd Venice Biennial in 2007. And just to mention some of the actions she was a part of, she was in the 28th São Paulo Biennial in 2008. She was also in the Bucharest Biennial in 2010, Lubumbashi Biennial in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2013, Taipei Biennial in 2016, and more recently, Guangzhou Biennial in 2018. She has shown individually and in institutions in Portugal, France, Belgium, Germany, United States, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, Congo, Mozambique, and last year she had the retrospective of her work at the SEGAC in Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in Spain. So this is the final part, because somehow the work of a work traveled always over Spain, into France, England, Germany, Belgium, but it never stayed in Spain. So last year was the first big museum exhibition that we did together in Galicia. And this exhibition in the gallery is called, they would translate into past perfect, I guess. It's Pretérito Perfecto. It's an exhibition that deals with memory and monument and grief even. And the three artists that are part of the exhibition have different mechanisms to deal with this kind of revision of history, or at least looking at history in a critical way. Your piece is an homage to Miriam Makeba, and in your process as an artist, you have several works that are homage. Talk Tower for Ingrid Jonker in 2012, to mention just one example. And Dalava Sob Exil, which is actually a piece from 2019. Can you tell us a little bit about the process behind these two works, and maybe explain a little why it's important for you to pay homage to these personalities? Maybe you could start out by telling a little bit about the piece that is now in the exhibition in the gallery, Dalava.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Bruno, for curating my work into this exhibition. It is, in fact, a great honor to be in a show in Spain for the reasons that you've just mentioned, because I've always felt slightly underrepresented in Spain and haven't ever quite understood why, but I think time will unfold that. So it's particularly significant for me to be in an exhibition in Madrid, and it's doubly significant for me to be in an exhibition in Madrid, which is an exhibition that so well represents my concerns and the contours of my practice and my political preoccupations, and with two artists that I admire hugely. And so it is, I of course haven't been in the space because we are all separated, but it is hugely important for me. And yeah, so to start off with, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. So to go on to Dalava Sob Exil and to Miriam Makeba, yes, you are quite right. This is, in fact, not the last one in a series of homages that I've done, because I've now, since then, done two more, one for Angela Davis, and I'm opening on Tuesday here in Lisbon a talk tower for Farruh Farrokhzad, who is an Iranian poet. But this comes in a long line of works which actually started in Cape Town in the very early 2000s, the first of which was actually a homage to James Polly, who was a man who curated a film festival for many years during apartheid, and enabled people like myself to construct a cultural consciousness and a visuality that was beyond what was then South African apartheid society, which was duly boycotted and closed off from the rest of the world. So people like James Polly, at quite an expense to his own safety, etc., put together these film festivals and dispersed amongst young people like myself looking for other ways of looking at the world, and enabled me a great privilege at the time. And at one point I felt that this man deserved to be given some credit, and he deserved to be linked to my work. So the first work is actually called A Woman Like Polly, and it is a homage to James Pollage. That's the first homage work that appears in the work in my work, and since then there's been a whole lot of them, and the reasons for them to happen are not very different. A lot of my work has a few lines of investigation, as you well know, but some of them are fairly critical, hard lines of investigation. And I mean hard in the sense that if you do research on, for example, the ethnographer's couple, Margot and Georges Diège, the material that you are involved with is often quite depressing.
Yeah.
It's heavy material. And at some point in one's practice, one needs to have a constructive, happier, more positive, forward-looking mark, sentence, language. And the way I've done that is to look at the people that have affected me or that have been role models for me, people who have represented what I suppose I would like to have been, and have served as beacons for how to conduct one's life in different circumstances. So Carlos Cardoso, Ingrid Jonker, who was a white South African poet who committed suicide because she was so heavily repressed by a regime and her family. And then we come to many others, but we come to Miriam Makeba. And Makeba is, of course, a symbol and a star for all South Africans and for many people around the world. So she's not an unknown in that way. But what interested me and what attracted me to paying homage to Makeba is that she was not just a singer. She was just not a superstar only. She was also a mother, a family person. She was a political activist. You know, she's the first African woman to speak at the United Nations. She's definitely kicked out of South Africa, literally pushed out of the United States for her political points of view in public and for having married Stokely Carmichael, who was a Black Panther Party member and was at that time considered one of the most dangerous people, you know, in the United States. And she looks, I mean, so there's a combination of somebody who's an African woman who cannot conduct her life from her country, which is South Africa, but against all odds goes and forges herself an incredibly creative career and a family life, and a stand politically, and she does it eventually out of Guinea-Conakry. And I guess it's the moment when I realized she'd been in Guinea-Conakry that I decided I wanted to make something about her, because I see her going back to Africa and trying to make a life and a career for herself from Africa. But
in a very utopian situation back then.
A very utopian moment in the history of Guinea-Conakry, yeah. And yeah, this is also very important, that one also has to see, particularly with these homages, you really do have to understand the political context and the social context at the moment where each of one of these people lived. I mean, the one homage was about Peter Blum, who was a youngster whose parents left Austria, Jewish family, escaping the Anschluss, and ended up settling in South Africa. So you need to understand, in order to understand the work, I guess you need to have a bit more information. Luckily enough, with Miriam Makeba, it's easier to transmit that information because she has such a presence internationally.
Yeah.
Who hasn't heard of Pata Pata, or you know, who hasn't seen an image of this gloriously beautiful woman with this incredible voice, you know? So she has a popular reach amongst the larger public, and of course that makes the work much more easier to enter and easier for the spectator to be curious about. But the driving force between all these homages is always about these are people that are role models for me, and that I want to share as role models as a positive input.
So, in this particular case for Dalaba, what is very striking for me and showing of your practice and the ways that you work your pieces with multiple layers is that you're doing an homage to this political activist. I mean, this singer, this pop star, but also this political activist. You're putting a light on the political side that is often not so known. But it's also a wonderful reflection on the mental mechanisms of trying to create a home when you're an exile. And that for me is it's like another layer on top that is opens up the piece in a wonderful way, and I think it's especially relevant in a moment such as we are living now, where Europe is in a way pretty much closing its borders to political exiles, and there's people dying in the Mediterranean every day. So do you think that this kind of reach is possible? I mean, do you thought about this? It's something that's
Yeah, lovely question. Everything you say is absolutely relevant. The fact that I found images of the house that Miriam Makeba built in Dalaba was a double invitation, because I love working with architecture, because architecture is very much my language, the one that I've unpacked critically, and particularly in relation to Africa abundantly, but also because in this case the architecture represented the home and it was the place of exile. She chose Dalaba because Dalaba reminded her of the countryside around Johannesburg, where she came from. So she wanted to implant herself in the ground in a place that made sense to her from home. And of course, I'm not an exile, but I, as you know, am a person who's been dispersed in space and geography in between.
You have a very particular position, but we can.
But so that the fact of like having been born in one place and then having laid down my conceptual roots in South Africa and then now living in Lisbon, all this gives me some understanding of what the idea of exile is and what the idea of being away from a place is, and gives me a lot of empathy for her particular role and her particular time spent in Dalaba. And that was definitely one of the very strong factors for me to take that project with that house in that particular time. There's huge empathy between the woman, the exile in Dalaba, and my own relationship to space and Africa and birth and being away from, in many ways, the history of Africa has estranged me, for example, from Mozambique, much more than I would have probably been estranged anyway. So there are parallels. And then I think it's the issue of exile is paramount today, and living in Europe and assuming that as part of my identity as well, it's of great sadness. It's with great sadness that that I cannot see Europe approaching the issue of exiles and refugees in a constructive way, you know. And it's funny that you mention that, because it's an issue that I'm completely alerted to. Like my thermometer is always switched on for that issue. And just to give you a very simple, homely reference, Hannah Arendt, who first wrote about refugees because she was a refugee herself, when staying in Lisbon in between escaping and from Central Europe and going off to America, lived in Lisbon for 2 years. And she lived down the road.
Oh yeah.
One block down, I walk past that house every day with my dog, when I walk my dog. And the city council has done a very beautiful homage to her by imprinting onto the pavement one of the sentences from her. She wrote here a text about refugees. And what's on the wall, on the floor, is something like, I can't quote verbatim, but it's something like, Europe has destroyed itself by not being able to look after its own refugees.
Mm.
And this is a very symbolic value in my everyday experience, and is a lot of food for thought, because it's something you encounter every day. Yesterday, I was listening to a friend who's just published a book on the Holocaust, Irene Pimentel.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things she says, which I think is really relevant for us, is that one of the big problems with the amount of Jewish people that were eventually annihilated in the Holocaust was the fact that many of them, but many, like we're talking about huge numbers, tried to escape Germany before the war started, when they started feeling the pressure. But the European border countries refused their entries. So what you have is actually, okay, we know the story of the Holocaust, and we're not going to discuss that. But what you understand when you hear these things is that these relationships are very complex.
Yeah,
you know, that the French, the Italians, and the Austrians and the Polish were implicit in the events that took place in that situation. And of course, I'm only using this as an example because one has a sense that the same is happening now, or that we are moving towards something. We don't know what kind of horror is going to happen, but it's possible something very serious could happen regarding that. So yes, that's what I said. Thank you for asking. Really important question, particularly to do with Miriam.
Yeah, I think what is incredible about this piece is that when you put together these ideas with this kind of reach, like you said, you get this, you create the chance for the audience to have some empathy for this position of the exiled person, because they can relate to Miriam Makeba in a way that probably they cannot relate to somebody that they read on the newspaper every day that just died on the Mediterranean. So I think the piece is really important because of that, not just because of that, but that's incredible. And just to take you up on something more specific, you mentioned that architecture is your thing. And you create this kind of structures that are not that are something like a big scale model, like impossible scale model, and sculpture with a life size approach. So can you tell us a little bit about do you have a love-hate relationship to modernism, or do you think that because a lot of your work centers around modernism for reasons that we all know about, but could you expand a little bit on why create these kind of structures that are also minimalist in the way that they're done, and there's something of a sculpture in them, and at the same time they're so big that they could be architecture.
Yeah, when one works with architecture, there's always that conversation about, you know, when is it a model, when is it a maquette, when is it a sculpture, when is it an architecture? You know, I don't worry too much about that. Actually, I make the sculptures. I'm really interested in sculpture. I've never wanted to be an architect. I'm really interested in sculpture, and I make the sculptures to suit my practice. So it would be to suit what I think they should be in terms of how they communicate with the public, how they relate to the space where they're going to be shown in. And so I stay very much within the discourse of sculpture rather than trying to establish any more discourses with architecture.
But you have done models. I mean, models in the sense that you can hover above them and understand have a bird's eye view over them. But you also do this kind of large-scale objects. They're not one-to-one in scale, but they're close to it, like 1-3.
Well, for example, Maison Tropicale was one to one.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, funny enough, the mechanisms of Maison Tropicale and the mechanisms of Dalaba are very similar, because what I did in Maison Tropicale was use the prototype pieces of Jean Prouvais's house and replicate them in wood, but exactly to the scale that he designed them. It's just that because you take them apart as pieces of a puzzle and then you put them together, it's no longer a house in a conventional looking object. It was more like a container. But so there, as I said, it made complete sense to stick to the actual size of the architecture that was being referred to. And to be able to create a situation where you as a person could actually enter that structure, so you could inhabit the architecture. With Dalaba, I very specifically looked at the house, and my test was, how do I represent this house for somebody that isn't seeing the object and isn't just looking at the photograph? How do I say something about the house through representing the house? And when I say something, I obviously mean sculpturally. So I clearly identified 3 portions of the house that I thought were conceptually symbolic. The one was the veranda, where she sat, and she writes about sitting on the veranda and looking at the view that reminded her of the Gauteng in South Africa. The other was the entrance porch of the house, which is a strange modernist structure. And the third is the roof, which is on show at your exhibition, because the roof is also what defines the drawing of the house, which is a rondavel. So by looking at the roof, you can identify the shape of the dwelling, of the building. You can look at the entrance, and you can read like modernist architectural traces that kind of glued onto this rondavel. And then there's this strange balcony, a huge balcony, like right around the one side of the house, which is absolutely clearly inviting to establish a relationship with a landscape. And so, as you know, the whole project is not represented in the exhibition. We would never be able to fit it in, But that's how I kind of unpacked the idea of architecture into
the most important elements in a way.
Yeah, to say something about the project. Then, of course, it's activated by the sound, by the posters. There's a lot of other stuff that activated and that you've got in the exhibition there. But then the way you were also mentioning modernism and why I was interested in modernism. I'm interested in modernism at large. It's the architecture, but it's not. I mean, my relationship to minimalism is also through modernism.
Yeah.
Minimalism is like, to me, the pinnacle of modernism, but in the visual arts in the 20th century, But the kind of architecture that we're talking about, modernist architecture, that interests me is very particularly the African stuff.
Yeah.
Because it is so
tropical modernism.
People call it that. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a good term, but I don't know if it describes everything. You know?
And it's an exercise at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a redemption, because the thing about African modernism is that it is entwined with the colonial project.
Yeah,
there's no getting away from it. But then it's also obviously entwined with the post-independence, because these were the buildings that were inhabited by the new governments after independence, and it's still entwined to today because the buildings are still there, So that's really why modernism in Africa interested. Also to do with the fact that that's where I come from. That's the language I was born into. So Maputo is an utmost modernist city. I was brought up and born in a modernist house. So sometimes we just work with what's our own, and that's...
And strangely here, I lived in a very modernist neighborhood in Alvalade for a number of years. And this was before I started going to Angola. And then I arrived there. It's like, wow, it's the same architects. It's the same kind of houses. And that's a very complicated trick on your mind when you are in what was formerly the metropolis, right? The colonial head state, and then the former colonies, and you see the same architects doing work, which is, it's like they're ruins that stand the test of time, and they're inhabited by different people, and then sometimes they are negated, sometimes they're not. It's very complicated legacy.
And it's toxic, as you well put it. It's very toxic, and that's why it's interesting, because it's also, and just to elaborate a little bit on that, modernism, and I say this both for the art and the architecture, and particularly in Africa, and I'll explain, is toxic because it in itself, as a movement, was a progressive movement. The ideology behind inventing modernism wasn't necessarily an oppressive movement, but it gets appropriated in the context of history. It gets appropriated by some pretty ugly regimes, and it ends up being at the service of those regimes, and therefore becomes an autocratic kind of a language in itself. And I think that you talking a mind bend, that mind bend has always, for me, been like a source of inspiration, not in a positive sense, but it's so difficult to unpack how something that is thought of or conceived as being progressive and ends up being appropriated as an autocratic language. How do you unpack those two facts that are those two forces that are operating simultaneously? And in Africa, it's like the ultimate example of that. Never mind. You can go to an example of modernist architecture in Holland. It's beautiful. The design is incredible, but there's no tension there. There's no history played out there, Whereas in Africa, every modernist building has history kind of coming out of its ears, windows and doors, And the same, funny enough, applies for modernism in the art world, in my view. And it's not unsimilar in the sense that if you look at, and this I started conceiving of when I was in my late stages of art school in South Africa. When you start looking at modernist art, i.e. the third half of the 20th century, from 60s, 70s sort of thing, you start realizing that this incredible work that people like Judd were doing, Richard Serra were doing, all this stuff that I was kind of educated into, was very autocratic as well.
Yeah, I was going to talk about sites and services.
Yeah, that leads to that.
Maybe Pedro can show us some of the images that we had. We had this piece at the exhibition last year at the SEGAC. It's the ones on the floor. If Pedro can show us, because for me, it was my first contact with your work. I was still an art student, and all of a sudden, it's not this one is palm, it's another one. And continue. Sorry, this is my fault. I gave Pedro all the images without any context, so we have to work like this. This is it. So the first time I saw these pieces, it was the first time I had contact with your work. And most of the artwork done in Portugal back then and for a long time was very much formal in nature. The context where I learned about art was always thinking about art, questioning itself, and very much kind of almost like there was no Portuguese dilemmas, that we were importing everything from the hegemonical centers in the North Atlantic. So there was a lot of exhibitions, big exhibitions by North American artists, German artists, and a lot of the work that you could see was very formal in nature. And when I saw this project of yours, this very minimalist forms, not done by hand, or they didn't look done by hands, like following the precepts of minimalism in a way. But then there was a political subtext so strong. I mean, it looked like something from the North Atlantic, but then the questions were local and from a very specific place in Africa.
Mm.
So, and that blew my mind. Sorry for the expression, but it was something that I could not cope with. How can I look at something that looks like a Donald Judd, but then there's this kind of political history around it? So, could you please tell us a little bit how this came to be? And
Yeah, interesting to go back 30 years. I think the question was, I should just say, Sites and Services, which is what we're looking at, was the first work that I ever made where I felt my practice could have traction. I mean, when I left art school, which I completed fairly well, you know, this very North Atlantic oriented, as you say, education, I very quickly understood that I was very attached to the idea of thinking art and art through thinking, and which is northern hemisphere language. I really loved contemporary art, but I was also very quickly aware of the fact that I was African, living in the tip of the continent, and the country was burning, and I needed to think about that. And I also realized that, and so I started unpacking the things I liked. And one of the things I had to unpack was, in fact, minimalism and modernist sculpture. And the more I looked at Judd and Sarah and all these people, the more I thought, and even Smithson, you know, although I have a particular soft spot for Smithson because he was more complicated, but I'm talking in the more pure guys, you know, the Carl Andres, the Richard Serras, the Donald Judd. The more I realized that their formal project was incredible, but that the fact that they were forever trying to empty their forms of content was really irritating. And that there was the same thing as the but finding that they were imposing this, trying to impose on other people everywhere in the world that was the only language that was applicable. And if you didn't practice with that language, you were definitely an outsider, you know. And the fact that they were insistent on emptying the object from meaning, content, and mostly context.
yeah.
So, you know, you could literally make a Donald Judd, and then you could take it to Cape Town, and then you could take it to the Philippines, and then you could take it anywhere, and it would always be the same thing. And I kept thinking, there's a lot of crap. This can't be, you know, this can't be. And so I kind of reversed the processes. I started looking around me for stuff that was minimalist, but that had context. And my stopping moment, my first stopping moment was Sites and Services. Not the sculptures that I've made, but the photographs that I took. So I encounter an enormous field of cement structures, little cement structures, which are toilets, the series of toilets. It's an urbanization project. And before people come in to build their dwellings, when you look at the field with 3,000 toilets and a couple of roads and lighting system, it looks like an incredible minimalist sculpture.
Yes.
You know, in fact, it could be land art.
Yeah.
And the first times I showed this work, people would say to me, wow, you've been working hard. This is quite a big project. Now I'd say, no, nowhere near that. It's the South African government that builds this, not me.
Yeah.
And then I had these images that were incredibly sculptural. And I understood that if I produced objects that were more formal and more similar to minimalist approach to sculpture making, and I put the photographs in front of the sculptures, I would inevitably be inviting the viewer to negotiate between the photographs and the sculptures. And because the photographs are so clearly not minimalist sculpture, in my view, that some tension would occur. And so what you're describing as a viewer is kind of like the perfect observer for me, the person who comes to it and said, oh, now we're 1991 here, and I can see this is minimalist sculpture, but it's not minimalist sculpture. Now, what is this other stuff that it's not documentary photography, but she didn't build the cement toilet. And trying to negotiate the space. And in my naivete at the time, I remember people would often ask me, so what is the meaning of the work you're doing? And that was a very intimidating question because I didn't have the clarity I have today.
Yeah,
I was much younger, much more insecure. And my answer would often be, I'm not sure what this work means, but I know it's somewhere between the photographs and the sculptures. So don't fix yourself on one and don't fix yourself on the other. But it's the traveling between the two that's going to give you the hint as to where the meaning. That's how far I could go. And that was for many years. I couldn't go much further than that, but I kind of sensed I was on a path that had traction and that I could work with. So it was rebelling against minimalism, but also I have to say, and that it would be probably untrue for me not to add this. I was also very clear, because there was a lot of people in South Africa that I was becoming friends with and becoming part of a community where there was a lot of political art being made. And some of it was much more rhetorical, much more pamphleteering. And in fact, as you know, I was part of groups where we painted political murals. So we were kind of, I was inserted in a dynamic of young people who were generally anti-apartheid and wanted to make some kind of a personal statement against it. But I was very clear, here the murals are, which we repainted in Segak, in Galicia last year.
Yes. These are, what we're looking at now is a mural at the entrance of the Segak. We wanted to take control of the whole building, so we occupied the rooms of the building, but also the entrance. And Angela installed this wonderful piece that is a series of murals that are painted in wherever position they were. And also these two sculptures that are part of it. This work also features Miriam Makeba.
She's the first time she comes in there. Yes, she crosses this path. This is a complex work with a lot of things happening and
at the same time.
Yeah. But what's interesting that in relation to what we were saying is that these murals, which I replicated in this work here called Pan-African Unity Mural, and which I had to ask for the permission of the 14 muralists. But this work that I participated in still exists. The mural still exists in Cape Town, and it was painted no more than about a year and a half or 2 years maximum of me making sites and services. Oh. And what I was going to say was that when I started sites and services, because of my experiences here, I kind of knew that in my own practice as an artist, I was very clear I wanted to be an artist, and from very early on, and that wasn't also normal in everybody that I privied with at the time. People went on to be designers, politicians, anyway. But I also knew that in my own practice, I did not want to make pamphleteering work. I didn't want to make rhetorical, political work. I wanted to make conceptual work that was founded and rooted in deep political thought and political message, but wasn't on this level. There's a different purpose. I mean, this is a public thing. You know, people are walking past it every day. The language of it is to appeal to the communication of very quick political ideas. I love doing these projects. I'm hugely proud of them. But in my practice, I knew this was not the way I wanted to go.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that we actually came up in our conversation to two works.
We'll get back to this. Here they appear more like citations, right?
Well, they are citations, yeah.
Instead of what you do. I want to go back a little bit and ground a little bit the talk to the exhibition in Madrid again.
Mm-hmm.
So Pedro, if you could show us again. Oh,
There
thank
we
you. This is just perfect.
Lovely.
Tell us a little bit about your relation between you build these objects, but then you have these photos that are kind of like documental photos, it's like evidence of something. Tell us a little bit about the relation between the objects that you build that make us feel the experience in a way, because they're big enough so we can feel the scale, but then you have the photos. In the case of Maison Tropicale, you even went to Niamey and Brazzaville just try and find the Beauvais houses, not tropical houses. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I guess it's the long tradition in my work that comes from the relationship between the visual image and the sculptural image. You know, that traveling between one and the other, I've found, is always a very rich one. And one of the things I keep a lot in mind when I'm making a work is, how am I communicating? And when have I finished what I think should be communicated in this project, whichever one I'm working with. So in Maison Tropicale, for example, I designed and we built the sculpture, the large 10-meter sculpture. And at one point in the middle of building that, I realized that the project wasn't complete.
Yeah.
And that there was lacking visuality, and that I needed, and that's when I started searching for the remnants of the houses via people we connected in the two cities. And we asked people to go and find the places where they had been installed and document them. And then eventually we went there ourselves and documented those places, and they were included. So again, you had to travel between the places, the photographs of the places where the houses had been stolen from, and then the sculpture, which is the rendition of the house in some way. Pretty much the same happens here and happens with all of them. I mean, as I was making, I first saw this house in a documentary, a fleeting documentary about Miriam Makeba. And then I couldn't go there to Dalaba, but I connected a photographer in Conakry and hired him to travel to Dalaba from Conakry, and through the phone and messaging got him to find the house, to go there, the house, and well, so he had instructions where to photograph from, how to look at it inside, outside, details on the wall, etc., etc. So then, you know, those photographs arrive, and they are my first kind of source material to work with. And when we finished the sculptures, I was I didn't feel the project was complete. So I then engaged in a series of other negotiations, of which these are two of them. The one is to allow the public to see the images that I was working with as source material, you know. And the others are, I mean, I had at the time, I mean, with time things, and this is already almost 2 years ago, but at the time I had so much information about Miriam Makeba. I was so kind of loaded with the complexities of the meaning of her role and her personality, that I thought I need to make a work which is just a very simple graphic word work in which I tell the story of what I think, instead of leaving it to the museum to write down the story, or the curator, or...
No, and it's incredible because there's parts that you give more attention or more focus than others. Like, just to name an example, Sékou Touré as utopian project that then later
Became horrible,
became horrible, and it's like you're focused on the beginning, the house, the family, the exile, but that is not that is another. It's something that you don't focus on, and it's interesting because it's like you're telling the piece in your way, in your vision, and then that is very interesting. Yeah.
But another thing that's interesting, and I don't know how I'd be doing for time. You tell
Yeah,
me.
we're terrible with time, but
you tell me. No, I'm happy to finish if you want to finish.
No. I'm just, if anybody has any questions, maybe we can open up to the public, or we continue to speak a little bit more. If your coffee is still warm, and if you still have cookies.
Well, we do have one question. It comes this way, like related a little bit to the recent change of name at Witte de With in Rotterdam, and also like these contemporary reshaping of important figures in our history or histories. Does the paying homage to important figures erased or silenced in history could provoke also the rethinking of present homage to controversial figures still standing? And if so, is there a movement towards reshaping these references in Africa nowadays? Do you think, Angela, that your work somehow plays with that? I mean, paying an homage to someone who's been silenced or who's been erased in the making of the story of history, does that also recalibrates the controversial homage that there are to other less important or controversial figures in history?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Absolutely, it does. I do see my project on the whole as a revisionist project. A lot of my intentions, a lot of my underlying intentions in all my projects are very closely tied to looking at events, houses, people in a different way. So unpacking the history that concerns me, which is the African history, and the history of Portugal in many ways, and sometimes extending to other spots as well, but unpacking it in a critical way. When I, for example, did a project on Jean Rouch in Mozambique, and I was specifically focusing on the workshops that he ran in Mozambique, I was very intent on the fact that he had put together an educational project that was visionary and was a huge investment on his part. And in a way, I was paying homage not to Jean Rouch, the man who did Petit à Petit, but actually Jean Rouch and the many, many, many people who run these incredible educational projects. I'm particularly interested in the ones in Africa, but you don't have to be stuck to Africa and that, but they run these projects almost as unknowns. Nobody knows about them. Nobody knows who they are. No credit. They're not artists. They're not filmmakers. They're not writers. So they're incognito. So in a way, my project as a whole, my art practice is, I consider it a revisionist one. And when I choose to do these homages, it is precisely for that reason. It's actually pointing to that which needs to be underlined and has been omitted and has been, the lights have been off on these people. The spotlights have not, for various historical and political reasons, these figures in time have not been allowed to have the credit that they deserve. And I can go on, there's Carlos Cardoso from Mozambique, a genius who invented fax newspapers. You know, the guy from the New York Times came to Mozambique after independence in a country ridden with civil war to find out how this man in the east of Africa, lost in what was then considered the poorest country of the world. And he had invented, because he was censored and wasn't allowed to write for newspapers, he invented a newspaper by fax. So he was transmitting every night to New York, to France, to Johannesburg, to Lagos, to wherever. I'm hugely in awe of Carlos Cardoso and his project, but nobody pays tribute. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but yes, I think that I prefer to do it through the underlying the good things rather than always criticizing things, which I do some of anyway.
Okay, also related to the topic, do you think that these tributes and these installations, when placed and displayed in galleries, do they get positively or negatively contaminated? How is the final relationship it establishes with this space? How do you see it finally functions within spaces, and how do these contamination works both ways?
Yeah, well, probably the question would need to be a bit more specific, but because I do works in very different spaces. For example, Bruno mentioned earlier on the Lumumbashi Biennale. Now, the Lumumbashi Biennale was my work was an outdoor work. It was a public work in the street. But then on the other hand, we sitting here talking about a commercial gallery in Madrid.
Nothing is innocent.
Nothing is innocent.
I think I can also talk a bit about this, and I'm not sure I understood the question fully, but as a curator, I try as best as I can to let the artists do the talking. I think my texts are becoming smaller and smaller, so I don't put them in a dead end, or so I don't co-opt their speeches, artistical ideas. But it's very different to do an exhibition by Angelo Ferreira and Grada Quilomba in Lisbon, in Berlin, or in Spain, which is a country for me, and I'm a guest in Spain. I live half of my time in Spain, and it's a country that I think it's incredible, but it has its problems with history, as does Portugal, but they're specific, they're different. So I think it's not completely innocent that in Spain you do an exhibition about the past, in a country where there's certain aspects of the past that you cannot deal with. As is Portugal, but it's different. Portugal has a very benevolent view of itself. It considers itself a non-racist country when it's riddled with problems related to racism, and is been for a long time without looking or being unable to talk about its colonial history. Spain, the problems are different, but there's also a problem with the past, and I guess in every country. But when you move the works, and we were talking about exiled people, when you move a work, you think about there's almost instantly, you think metaphorically about what's going on around you. And I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you to talk to you, Angela, about in Galicia, in Segag, we did the exhibition was called Pouco a Pouco, which translates into English to Little by Little, which actually was taken from the title. We decided the title. It's the title of a movie by Jean Rouch, It is called Petit à Petit. It's a very, at least the first half of the movie, it's very comical. It's the story of an African man that goes to France and he does reverse ethnography on French people. So he goes around in the city and measures heads and teeth, and he analyzes the women's clothing, and he realizes that the trees have no air to breathe. So it's a kind of Europe looking at on itself on the mirror in Africa. So France being exotized by an African man. And we wanted to have this kind of hint of humor, because the idea of little by little, and because it was a retrospective of Angela's work, and for a long time she was working alone on these kind of questions. No one wanted to address this, least of all in the arts. She was really working alone. So I'm giving you context, but I want to ask you, Angela, do you think that the context changed, and in each way, what do you feel right now?
Yeah, it's difficult, and people often ask me that question. It's a difficult one to answer because the context has obviously changed. You know, the African population in this country, the descendants have gained voice and space. But also the discourse has become, you know, post-colonial, decolonial, has become popular and popularized, which is great. And so that has changed. I think things do have changed on the ground. I'm not saying they've changed enough, or, you know, that we are, you know, a brilliantly resolved society in Portugal in that respect by a long shot. But I think things have changed. But also, I think, you know, it's been 30 years since I've been working. So my practice has grown and the body of work has kind of like asserted itself in a way, not because I try to do it to assert itself, but just it asserts itself as you go on making work. And if your interests stay the same and if you are working on the same issues on and on and on, eventually people will listen to you. Or listen more to you than they did before. So I think it's a combination of things, you know, that the context has changed and it has opened up. But I've also just been at it for so long, and there are more people listening to here in Portugal. And it doesn't apply to Spain. I have no idea who listens to me in Spain, but in Portugal, I have a little bit of an idea, you know, and that's how things go. Like, I mean, in South Africa, I find that also the amount of what people listen to me changes a lot. It depends a lot on how often I show there, you know, how often I can have an exhibition there. So all that is very fluid and fluent, you know, it's not a static thing, but yes, things have improved, changed, and become a lot more positive in many ways, which goes back to the question that was asked there, you know, like, does being in different contexts rub off onto your practice or not? You know, does it have an effect? Yeah, look, when I was much younger, you know, there was a big thing about, you know, can you have a political practice, and then can you be coerced into, you know, big museums and commercial galleries? Those were very like relevant questions in the 80s and 90s that have in some way for me washed away, because as I said, you know, my practice is so defined in a way. You know, I'm comfortable in my area of study, so to speak. That not every gallery and not every museum is going to be interested in my work. In fact, if anything, I could complain that I get ostracized for not being a really popular artist. And I mean, I could mention a few in Portugal that are much more popular. You know. Popular in terms of museums, scale of shows, sales of work, you know, I don't want to mention names, but, and I'm sure the same applies to Spain. So yes, I think that your practice can be diminished by context, but I think you can also demand more context and demand more space, which is more my approach, and demand that you are heard and seen on your grounds, and, you know, always saying what you want to say in whichever way you want to say. That's your right as an artist, you know. And then whether it happens and grows or not, well, we'll have to wait and see. That's how it goes. I'm not sure we answered the question, but we certainly tried.
Okay, so we thought on unmuting everyone so then we can have some sort of conversation. We're just not a big amount of people, so I think we can have it organized. And we have a question from Lee.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. So for Angela, I guess the roof piece that is in the gallery, what's so striking about it to me is how kind of clean, crisp, metallic, shining really it is, which contrasts a lot to the actual house in Dalaba that you have in the photo. And I was just curious, was there an intentional message or statement in that contrast that you've done there, or was just eager to get a little more insight, I guess, into that particular piece?
Yeah. No, I think that I'm very happy if you read meaning into that. But as I said earlier on, thanks for the question. It's been put to me before, and it's not an easy question to answer, but I'm happy to give it a go. As I was saying to Bruno here, there's a point at which then my preoccupations are sculptural, and because I really enjoy sculpture, and it's to do with this whole love-hate thing that I was talking about with modernism and minimalism, and I'm more interested in transmitting with the main idea that I start off with. So I was more interested in the fact that the sculpture needed to speak about the circularity of the building, the corrugated iron, the use of corrugated iron, the structure with which it's built, which is a very basic, beautiful, efficient, but very basic structure. It was more closely to that. I also think that if you go to, to be honest, and since we are having a kind of smaller conversation here now, like the roof when the house was first built, which is when Miriam would have been there, that's pretty much what it would have looked like. If you start going by, now it's all dilapidated and falling apart and the paint's all gone and it's all rusty. Well, first of all, you're going on to history. It's now a little museum. And you start bringing in issues of who looks after it, and what are the museological capacities of a country like Conakry, which goes into kind of contemporary African politics. Not that I don't think that's interesting, but it just was not interesting for me in this project, if you know what I mean, Lee. So it's funny, I had the inverse problem. You mentioned that. I had the inverse problem with this other project that we've mentioned a few times, Maison Tropicale, which was also a house that had been dilapidated over 50 years, and that some collectors decided they would renovate. And they renovated the house to sell it ostensibly, but they renovated. It was also a metal house. It was also aluminium, but they renovated with the technology of the 21st century. So the product that they produced at the end was actually technologically more sophisticated than the original project, which had been built in 1949, as you can imagine, because our technology has advanced, So, and I remember thinking how offensive it was that we had to look at something that was so much more jewel-like than the original object would have been, and the intention of the original architect, Jean Prouvé in this case, So, yeah, they're interesting issues and points, but I particularly didn't want to go into that the politics of restoration and the politics of what the state, the maintenance of the house stands for and so on. But yeah, there's another whole project there. There's no doubt about it.
Exactly.
Don't tempt me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. So I had a kind of a not direct but kind of personal question, in not personal in terms of you personally, but for me, in Latin America there is this approach towards the European modernism as a failed project that in this peripheral space didn't work out. It worked out as a much more hybrid form of manifestations or languages. Do you think that I mean, obviously you've said that you've been your work emerged from this dialogue that comes from your own personal life of different places and spaces and persons that influenced you. Do you think there is do you think that finally, ultimately, your production in Europe talking about African matters also works in this kind of new hybrid form of European production per se? I mean, would you see that also that in Europe that could be like a new way of that there is this kind of a sort of, not a trend, but do you think there is also contamination from the peripheral regions of the world within Europe right now and European artistic production?
Right. I was listening to your question and
sorry, I went all about it, but at the end, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I was just not sure until the end whether the question was more referring to architecture or art production. But I think it became clear in the end that it is about art production. Was that right? Would you agree that, yeah? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure that I'm such a good person to answer this question because also because we've been stuck inside, in our own countries for so many months now. I think, are you pointing to the fact that there's a lot more African artists working in Europe at the moment? There's a lot more Latin American artists working in Europe at the moment. Is that what the question is pointing towards?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm sorry. The question was more in terms of how these important discourses from the margins, if you think that, I mean, in terms of your production, it's been part of it from the very start, from the very beginning. But do you think that that the European context sees it and seizes it nowadays? Do you think that it truly becomes part of it, or is it just like some sort of trendy object to be looked upon?
Well, difficult to tell. I mean, it's difficult to tell.
There's always
whether,
a risk.
Yeah, there's always a risk that the art world is incredibly fickle.
But just to put something in that, I think as a mechanism, it can be useful. It can be subversive in a way. Like you said before, this post-colonialism is now trendy, and that's great. That's incredibly honest of you, and it's and the meaning that you're saying that is because, yeah, great, because more people are talking about it. They may enter the discussion on a very superficial level, but then if more people get in, it's bound to get deeper, the discussion. And sometimes the works of artists are, I mean, for instance, your sculpture is very appealing. There's there's an aesthetic value to it that is incredible, and that attracts you. but then you reflect on what's going on. Grada Quilomba, to mention another example from the exhibition, is also very attractive. The video, the installation, but then the history is very complicated and complex. So I think that's not all bad when things become fashionable. It might be annoying. There's a risk of co-opting, which I think it's what you're talking about. But sometimes it could be something that you use in a way. It's like this painter that paints a very incredible painting that is very beautiful. You're attracted to the beauty of the painting, and then you realize the history is probably not that positive, or you can talk about a number of things. And that, I think that's something that artists have in their as a weapon, so to use military terms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I mean, I think, look, mine is maybe an old-fashioned approach, but I mean, or maybe my roots are so old-fashioned, like an old spirit or something. But the Western world, which is that determination which we used to use so often and probably still applies very well, still holds the power in the production of content, of critical content and art. I mean, that and the value. I mean, it's difficult to see, Japan's coming along, China's putting in a challenge, and then at one point in the 90s, it looked like Latin America was all the rage. And and then yes, I do think some Latin American thinkers got seriously integrated into the discourse. And if you think of other areas like Freire in education and so on, they're now taken hugely serious as major contenders, and the same happens to Africa. You got thinkers like Achille Mbembe, who are seriously considered, or Glissant, who are seriously considered as major philosophers in a contemporary field, no holds barred. But having said that, generally the discourses are still circulating via the Western hemisphere, Northern hemisphere, and whether that's going to eventually balance out, it's difficult to tell. It's kind of difficult to tell. I mean, because it's also incredibly linked to economy, financial power, as it has to be, because it's a market, So yeah, I know I'm not the good person to answer that question. I can just give a few thoughts like that. I'm not sure that helped at all. But
Did we answer your question, Bill?
Not really, but it wasn't necessary. I mean, it's like,
or we went in circles.
To hear a bit more of your thoughts. It's not like we're not, as you said, as you mentioned, Freire. So it's never a question to be fully, it's open to be discussed. I mean, thank you so much. It was great reflection though. Does anyone else has any question that they would like to?
So we have talked about the sculpture, architecture, and the text, the narrative for youth of making this personal homage to Miriam Makeba. But what about the record, the music? Do you think that's also very important to get to this feeling? Because I feel that when people get into the exhibition and see your installation, the sound really changed their attitude towards the piece. You can feel that it makes a whole different approach.
Wow, thank you for the question, and thank you for reminding. The sound, the sound is my first. It's my heart. It's where my heart is. As I said right from the beginning, the click that made me decide, okay, I'm going to do this project on Miriam Makeba is when I saw the house. And when I saw the house, I always think of the way she wanted to root herself back in Africa and the effort she made with the relationship with the ground. And so I've spoken quite a bit about how she was forever thinking back of the landscape around Johannesburg. And the finding of the song was almost simultaneous with the finding of the house and my thoughts, because it is one of her earlier songs. And it is about a piece of ground for an African woman. You know, it is about people who could not own land. In South Africa, black people couldn't own land until apartheid ended legally. So it's an incredibly emotive song for me. And it's also, I mean, this is just a vignette. It's also written by Jeremy Taylor, who is a South African who wrote a couple of popular, very popular childlike songs in my very, very young age in South Africa. One of them was called Ach Please Daddy. And it was the kind of national sort of exchange sing-along for children of about, I don't know, anywhere from 6 years old to 10 years old. So when I came across A Piece of Ground by Miriam Makeba, I loved the song. I just love the, you know, she's got an incredible voice. The song has got this very kind of early, almost Latin American. It's almost Latin American in its kind of musicality. And then when I went and looked at the details of the song and I found that Jeremy Taylor had written it, I realized that it had just about all the ingredients that I was interested in and brought back to my own history. Was I lived in South Africa when I was 6 years old, and I remember singing Ach Please Daddy with all the children, all the white children that I had to go to school with. So yeah, so the song for me also is very important, and I'm so pleased that Bruno, you chose the song to be part of because we had to order the 7 single. And often with museums and galleries, they're not so keen to just have a record player with a song playing in the space, but it makes a big difference because sound does go direct, unlike sculpture, unfortunately. I shouldn't say this because I'm a sculptor, but sound goes directly to your heart. It goes right in your ear and it goes directly to your heart. It doesn't have to be mediated by your brain. And yeah, so that's what I have to say about the song.
Yeah, that feeling, and when you read the text, that get very close to the homage in a way. You know, it's very personal. It makes it more poetically, apart from all the critical point of view. But it's.
I think that's the key for this piece is this kind of again the political history of it. But then the connection you get to Miriam Makeba, which in the possibility for empathy, that's what's very poetic and very humane about this piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if anyone else wants to do. We've been almost for one and a half hours. If anybody wants to know anything else about Angela, or we?
Yeah, maybe one last quick question. So, full disclosure, Angela, I actually work for Naspers, South African company.
Oh my God!
But only the last 6 years. So nothing to do with the sort of older era.
I can hear that.
But I know South Africa well. I've been down there a lot, so I really enjoyed the talk. I was curious, how often are you getting back down there? How are you still connected with South Africa there? What's your take on kind of the arts scene there? If you have an opinion, I was just curious.
Yes to all of them. Yes, I'm very connected to South Africa. I mean, now we're all stuck at home, unfortunately. So it's a little bit weird not to have been back in either Mozambique or South Africa in the last 8 months. And it's even weirder. So my husband left yesterday. He runs a project in Graaff-Reinet, which is a town right in the center of South Africa. And it's even more complex to think that I might not be able to go for Christmas either. The traveling there, as I'm sure you know, is still quite difficult and complex. But yes, I've my critical base is still in South Africa in many ways. Those are all my art school friends. That's where I lay down my political rules and my political roots and my thoughts. That's where I was politicized. So yeah, I have a very intense and close relationship with the country, both on a just human and social level, but with work. I had a big show at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. I don't know which city you visit more, but I imagine
mainly Cape Town. Yeah,
mainly Cape Town, right? Nice Paris would be mainly Cape Town, but Johannesburg Art Gallery is the equivalent to the Isiko National Gallery in Cape Town, but that's in the Johannesburg version. So I had a big retrospective show in 2017. That was 3 years ago, and you don't do one of those very often. It's a lot of work, and and also the distance makes it very complicated. And yeah, I work with the Mozambique Gallery, who goes to all the art fairs in South Africa.
And you're editing a book on
Mozambican
artists.
Basically, yeah, I'm editing a book which should come out in a month, about Mozambique art, contemporary art. So yes, I'm part of the research center at Wits University. I work with the Wits City Institute with Nolene Murray, and we've done projects together, and I'm writing for a book for them as well. I'm as connected as I can be. The distances are huge and expensive, so it does create difficulty. And my work is collected by a few people in South Africa. I think the South African, the amount of artists is just exploding, and the kind of work that's being done is very interesting and very vital. And it's very exciting, hugely exciting, quite intimidating, in fact, but brilliant. And also, there's a lot of people writing and a lot of academics coming out of the universities. As you know. Yeah. South Africa has a huge amount of universities of a very good standard, and they are producing academics all the time. In fact, for the Mozambique book, we had to hold back not to invite so many South Africans, because I think the Mozambicans will say, okay, enough South Africans now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Lee.
Nice to meet you. Yes.
So I think we can finish here.
Yeah.
If you're okay. It was a pleasure talking to you, Angela, as always. I keep finding new ways to see your work. It's an ongoing discovery that doesn't happen a lot. I think if anyone here hasn't seen the show, you should see the show. If you can go to Madrid, if you're in Madrid, and
or online.
Yes, or online. Actually, we have a nice version online of the exhibition.
But it's never the same.
No, it's never the same, but it's very competent. It's unexpected for me. Well, Nerea, thank you so much. Idoia, Pedro, you want to say something, Nerea, to close it off?
Thank you very much, Bruno. For us, this show was going to happen in April. So for us, with all this confinement, it was terrible news that we couldn't have it. But we had huge expectations for the show, but the show has been even nicer and better than we expected. So just thank you, Bruno, and really, Angela, for us having your work in the gallery. it's really very important. So
I
really thank
want to thank you, Nerea, because I know my work's not easy. I mean, you know, it's
we're happy to have it.
people who take the trouble to find out about it and
Unfortunately, in the gallery, as Pedro and Idoia, we all know, we don't like very easy things. So, so it's very nice to have it.